I called the...
Okay.
I will say something and then I will introduce you, and then
Okay.
so you can see it.
Okay.
Oh, it's on.
Perfect. And then I'll just be able to scroll through like this?
Yes.
Okay.
The table? You want to sit with us for the beginning?
Oh, sure, of course. Good evening, everyone. We would like to begin. So, to those of you who do not know me, I am Shai Levit, the director of the Leer Jerusalem Institute. It is a great pleasure to open tonight's public lecture by our honorable guest, Professor Philip Gorski from Yale University. The public lecture is taking place within the framework of an international workshop titled Post-Secular Perspectives on the Sacred, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of Rudolf Otto's seminal book, Das Heilige. I would like to take this opportunity to also warmly welcome our international guests who have come from afar, as well as our local colleagues participating in the workshop. Let me, by way of introduction, say a few words on the organizing concept of our gathering, at least one of the organizing concepts, the post-secular. And I have to say that when I was preparing my notes, I kind of had a general public in mind, and now that I see this highly respectable and knowledgeable audience, I feel quite humbled and would have liked to change the comments that I've prepared, but it's too late for that. So I'd like to say a few words about the post-secular and its importance for understanding contemporary societies, especially Israeli society. One may begin by asking, to what extent are we living today in a post-secular society? What does that term mean? Post-secular, like many other posts fabricated by academics, postmodernism, post-colonialism, even post-Zionism, captures, I believe, some important insights, but may ultimately turn out to be misleading. On one level, the term post-secular captures the sociological observation that since the 1960s or 70s, religions have been playing a growing role in the public sphere. This phenomena was detected in many different places in North America and South America, and later in post-Soviet Eastern Europe, and with the growing migration of Muslims, has been on Europe's agenda for the past 2 decades at least, thus countering predictions by many observers of the late 19th and early 20th century that religion was not only fading away, but if not fading away, then finding refuge in the privacy of the home and the church. But it has become rather an important contester in the public arena. This sociological description has brought some leading liberal thinkers, Jürgen Habermas stands out as a prime example, to move from the descriptive to the normative and to recognize the positive contribution of religious traditions alongside secular traditions to our normative landscape. Others have drawn the opposite conclusion, adamantly opposing religious manifestations in the public sphere. To name one conspicuous example, the veil controversy in many Central and Western European countries. In Israel, arguably similar phenomena have led to the secularist outcry against Hadattah, the kind of growing religiosity, the growing religious influence on secular institutions, including the military, schools, and even higher education. What is clear, and I can say this partly based on my own research, Muslims and Jews, but mainly Muslims in Europe, and especially in Germany, is that we are not simply facing, obviously, the return of religion. Religion itself has transformed, often breaking with religious traditions. Religious feminism, not necessarily of a liberal kind, new, highly individualistic forms of religious spiritualism, breaking away from the religious churches, global religious affiliations, enabled by emerging social media that severed ties with local communities, and religious nationalism, more about which we will probably hear tonight. Or take, for example, a local case. We may be worried about Hadassah. Some of us may be worried about Hadassah in public schools, but how can we make sense of this Hadassah when its prime instigator, our Minister of Education, rejects the authority of rabbis, at least to the extent that he has fled from the religious party to form a new secular religious party. Religion may not have disappeared, but this does not imply that traditional ways of life have returned. New forms of religious life and experience have emerged, but these, I would like to suggest, are part of our new secular condition. We are not living in a post-secular society any more than calling our society postmodern means that we no longer live in a modern world. If the term post-secular society is nevertheless helpful, and I think it is because it helps us put into question familiar and overarching narratives of secularism that identify modernity with progressive processes of rationalization and prophesize the gradual decline of religion from the public sphere. It is not that our society, this is a double negation, it is not that our society is not secular, it is that secularism and modernity are not quite what we had thought. It is not simply about the rise of reason, progress, enlightenment. There is an internal dialectics of modernity, which many have pointed out, and perhaps more importantly, there are multiple modernities. And this is something that I actually had an opportunity to discuss with Professor Gorski earlier today. By the same token that we speak of multiple modernities and multiple secularities, we can speak, this is obviously following Eisenstadt, we can also speak of multiple sacrednesses and senses of the sacred in contemporary societies. Secular in Europe is not the same, or in Central Europe is not the same as in Eastern Europe, not the same in the Middle East or Southeast Asia. And yet, one thing that all secularities at least share in common is that they operate in the shadow or under the growing influence of a specific kind of secularism, of European and Christian secularism. And this is perhaps true in evidentiary ways in the case of Israel. Israel, since its foundation, was part of the region in terms of its complex relationship to secularism, but its concept of the secular has been borrowed from Europe, and the strong secularism and the understanding of the secular come from there. So thus we should strive to understand the Israeli secular and other secularisms in their relationship to the classic European model, if that exists, in post-Christian European secular and the post-Christian European secular legacy, while acknowledging the distinctness and uniqueness of the possibilities that this place and other regions have. Let me conclude by thanking and introducing Dr. Yochi Fischer for organizing the workshop. Dr. Fischer is one of the leading scholars in the field of secularism and discussions of post-secular here in Israel, and has contributed greatly to our understanding of the field locally and internationally. Let me mention just one of her important contributions, a collected volume in Hebrew, Secularity and Secularism, Interdisciplinary Investigations, which has become, in a very short time, canon in the field. Yochi is also the deputy director of this institute and the head of the Sacredness, Religion, and Secularization Cluster. I want to thank Yochi and her team here at the institute, Dr. Adam Klein-Oron, who's here with us, Shira Wolfenson-Bruck, for the outstanding work that they have put into organizing the workshop, and invite Yochi to open and to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shai. Tada.
The only free seat in the...
One of the most quoted paragraph from Rodolph Otto's classic book, Das Heilige, is where he requests that anyone not able to recall from his memory a moment of intense excitement about the mystery that lies beyond should not continue reading the book. Underlying his request was the assumption that religion is based on a state of consciousness that rests on an unmediated experience of the absolute other, of the holy. This experience is not rational, and therefore, without knowledge of, or at least some memory of the sacred experience, it is impossible to understand it. Sacredness can be understood only from within. 100 years later, religious and secular dichotomies on which the modern self was supposedly constructed have been blurred. They are as blurred as the attempt to classify ideologies, rituals, or experiments as being within or without the sacred. One of our goals here at the Sacredness, Religion, and Secularization theme at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute is to deepen the understanding of the contemporary challenges and tensions that Israel is facing in regards to those issues of religion in a post-secular society. As Shai mentioned, post-secular attitudes towards the sacred seek to go beyond modernistic assumptions and to look into the ways people believe, worship, and give meaning to their private and collective existence. Some would call it their religions, others their ideologies, their credo, their heroes, or their universal ethics. Is there a connection, for example, between new forms of religiosity in the public sphere and the evolving weight of sanctified human rights values or gender equality? How is this connected to populism, ethnocentrism, and rapid processes of secularization? We are honored to have with us this evening one of the most interesting and committed scholars dealing with those kind of questions. Professor Philip Gorski is a professor of sociology and religion studies at Yale University and one of the leading contemporary sociologists. His teaching and research focuses on religion and politics in early modern and modern Western Europe and North America, and he's particularly interested in the relationship between religion, nationalism, and conflict. He also works on social theory and the philosophy of social sciences, and Gorski is one of the leaders of the critical realist movement in North America. He uses both a comparative and historical perspectives and scrutinizes a wide range of religions and regions. His writings that stress the importance of theoretical approaches alongside nuanced contextuality paved the way to important scientific literature that critically reassesses the relationship between diverse religious movements and liberal democracies. His most recent book is American Covenant, A History of Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present. The book, who won a great deal of interest, shows in which ways the American civil religious tradition is now in peril, and with it, the American experiment as a whole. Gorski is one of the interesting public intellectuals to address contemporary challenging questions such as what is replacing traditional religion, and we are inspired to have him address us tonight.
Just a second. זה. Just a moment. תמר, תכבי את האור פה. יופי. זהו, it's a restart and it's okay. That's it. וואי, עד שהבנתי מה זה. אוקיי. Here we are.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Van Leer Institute and Shai Levi and Yochi Fischer for the kind invitation. Shir Wolfenson also for organizing this, and of course all of you for turning out this evening. As they mentioned, the occasion for this talk is the centenary of Rudolf Otto's famous book, The Idea of the Holy, das Heilige. And the talk that I'll be giving this evening focuses around this question of the relationship between sacrality and politics in the modern era, and in particular whether there is some specific connection between them. So the question is, has the secularization of Western democracies opened up a sort of God-shaped hole? A hole that is now being filled with so-called political religions. A growing number of American commentators seem to think so. David Brooks of the New York Times, I'm actually going to need a little bit of light here to read that. My eyes aren't quite what they used to be, I'm afraid. I'll do my best here. David Brooks of the New York Times was one of the first to sound the alarm. As America's religious and civic institutions have declined, he worries, the resulting vacuum is being filled by warrior heroes of pop culture. Americans are deriving a sense of identity and transcendence from partisan political combat rather than from local community or traditional religion as in the past. Andrew Sullivan of New York Magazine concurs, quote, everyone has a religion, he stipulates, a practice of life that gives meaning that cannot really be defended without recourse to some transcendent value. As the old religions continue to decline, he warns new ones are being born. On the American right, there's the cult of Trumpism. On the American left, the cult of wokesterism. That is, the multiculturalist movement with its rigid dogmas of political correctness and identity politics. Nor is this diagnosis confined to the ranks of anti-Trump conservatives. A number of liberal commentators have delivered a similar verdict. The intellectual historian Mark Lilla, for example, writes that the progressive left is in the midst of a pseudo-religious awakening. Quote, that one now hears the word woke everywhere is a giveaway that spiritual conversion rather than political agreement is the demand. Relentless speech surveillance, the protection of virgin ears, the inflation of venial sins into mortal ones, the burning of preachers, the banning of preachers of unclean ideas, all these campus identity follies have left their precedents in American revivalist religion. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff offer up a similar interpretation. They argue that, quote, the campus left operates like a religious sect. It divides the world into good and bad people, the woke and the unwoke. It quells internal dissent via periodic purges and witch hunts, expelling real and suspected heretics from its ranks, and it maintains communal purity by denying outsiders any access to the pulpit. Sects need enemies, of course. The enemy of the campus left, they argue, is the off-campus right, and of course, vice versa. Each sect provokes the other, and the result is an ever-escalating cycle of sectarian polarization. The contemporary context for discussions of secular political religion in the U.S. is clear enough. For nearly 2 decades now, levels of traditional religious belief and practice in the U.S. have been declining and at an accelerating rate, especially amongst the younger generation and the working classes. Meanwhile, birth rates and marriage rates have been declining as well, particularly amongst the better educated, and especially since the Great Recession of 2008. So has life expectancy. Increases in the suicide rate, the spread of opioid addiction, and the obesity rate are some of the driving causes. Conversely, rates of social isolation have been increasing. More and more people find themselves alone. And as if that all were not enough, the cycle of political polarization that began in the mid-1990s has now reached the point that many Democrats and Republicans regard one another with open contempt and even hatred. What is less clear to many, I think, is the deeper historical context for the present-day historical discussion of political religion, namely the interwar and pre-war literature on this subject. Indeed, it begins with the French Revolution, and more specifically with Edmund Burke's reaction to it. Having first compelled the Catholic priests of France to swear their loyalty to the Republic, the Jacobins then thought to replace the Catholic Church altogether, first with the deistic cult of the Supreme Being, and then with an agnostic cult of reason. These new religions had all the trappings of the old, amongst other things, saints and martyrs ensconced in the Pantheon in Paris, national holidays embedded in a new revolutionary calendar, and mass pilgrimages mapped onto a sacred geography of the French hexagon, all to the growing horror of the English sage Edmund Burke. Religion, he opined, is the basis of civil society, and man is by his constitution a religious animal. Should we uncover our nakedness by throwing off our religion, he warned, then some uncouth, pernicious, and degrading superstition will inevitably take its place. Burke hoped and believed that the march of equality and democracy could be halted. The French sociologist Alexis de Tocqueville did not. He was a liberal of sorts, unlike Burke, and yet he ultimately came to a similar assessment of Jacobinism. The French Revolution, he declared, was a political revolution that developed in the manner of a religious revolution. It became a new kind of religion, an imperfect religion, to be sure, without God, cult, or afterlife, yet a religion that, like Islam, inundated the earth with its soldiers, apostles, and martyrs. Burke and Tocqueville were amongst the first to sketch out a theory of political religion, but they themselves did not use that particular term. The term political religion first came into circulation during the interwar years between World War I and II. So far as I know, Rudolf Otto himself did not participate in this debate, in part because he was blessed with the mercy of an early death in 1937. But if he had, though, I expect his views would have been quite similar to those of the Austrian philosopher Erich Voegelin. Voegelin's famous book, The Political Religions, was first published in 1938, 1 year after Otto's death, in 1937, and 1 year before the Nazi invasion of Poland. Let's have a closer look at Voegelin's theory. You know the old saying about how Marx stood Hegel on his head. You might say that Voegelin stood Durkheim on his feet. In the elementary forms of the religious life, his seminal text on the sociology of religion, the great French sociologist had famously argued that all religions were based on a distinction between the sacred and the profane. And further, that collective representations of the sacred arose out of experiences of collective effervescence. That is, experiences of transcendence in which we lose our sense of self and feel at one with our environment. Religion, he concluded, is rooted in a real experience of transcendence, but it misrepresents the source of these experiences. The source, he says, is not within the divine, it's without in society. Fougelin's theory of political religions is a mirror image of Durkheim's theory of religion. Like Otto, Fougelin believed that human beings have an innate capacity for religious experience. Experiences of transcendence do not come from without, as Durkheim claimed, but rather from within. Also, like Otto, Fougelin believed that these experiences were individual, mystical experiences of joy and awe before the immensity and unity of the being that both underlies and transcends all existence. They were not just experiences of society. Finally, like Otto, Fougelin saw biblical religion as the most accurate and complete representation of the divine. Christianity, not totemism, as the purest form of religion. Otto and Fougelin were as much theologians as philosophers. So this is the background for Fougelin's theory of political religions. Political religions arise when we make the things of this world into objects of worship and of hope. In particular, when we worship class or race or nation, as occurs in Jacobinism, communism, fascism, and Nazism, for instance. In Fougelin's pithy phrase, political religions immanentize the eschaton. They immanentize the eschaton. They put the end of history back into history. So while Durkheim argued that religion arises when we turn social things into divine things, Fougelin argued that political religion arises when we turn social things into divine things. Now, Fougelin's is perhaps the best known theory of political religion, but it was not the only such theory, nor was it even the first. Interestingly, one of the first observers to note the quasi-religious characteristics of the popular political movements of the interwar years was none other than Bertrand Russell. Writing in 1920, following an extended visit to the Soviet Union, Russell had this to say: "The war has left throughout Europe a mood of disillusionment and despair which calls aloud for a new religion. Bolshevism has supplied the new religion. It promises glorious things, an end of injustice, of war, of the disunion of classes." Unlike Fougelin, Russell was not concerned about the heretical character of the new religion. He was, after all, an atheist and a scientific materialist. Nor was he worried about its anti-capitalism. He was also a socialist of sorts. What alarmed Russell was the irrational and hubristic character of Bolshevism. He predicted correctly that the Russian Revolution would result in tragedy rather than triumph, in tyranny rather than equality. If Bolshevism was the first example of a new religion in the interwar period, then fascism was, of course, the second. And Italian commentators were amongst the first to elaborate a full-fledged theory of political religions. One of the fiercest critics of Italian fascism was Luigi Sturzo. Sturzo began his career as a working-class priest in his native Sicily. He was also a leading figure in the Italian Popular Party. Following his exile in 1924, he turned his attentions to the nascent discipline of sociology. His critique of totalitarianism drew heavily on Catholic political theology and Catholic social teachings. His critique of totalitarianism was that it systematically obliterated the separation between spiritual and temporal power. It thereby destroyed, as he saw it, the dualistic system of rule by church and states that had emerged in Western Christendom during late antiquity. It replaced it with a monistic system in which the state had absolute and unchecked sovereignty. Or rather, it took absolutism to its logical conclusion. Sturzo also had a second critique as well. totalitarianism obliterated the separation of public and private life. It made education and family into instruments of the state, thereby violating the Catholic principle of subsidiarity. On Sturzo's reading, totalitarianism was not simply an unintended consequence of secularization. It was a direct result of a devil's bargain between certain segments of the Catholic clergy and the leaders of Italian fascism. Sturzo referred to this pact as clerico-fascism. Nor was the Italian fascism the only example of clerico-fascism. Similar alliances between churches and fascists could be observed throughout Europe, including even in Germany, where National Socialism and German Protestantism enjoyed an uncomfortably close relationship. The analyses of political religion that I have enumerated so far differ in their political and religious orientations. Burke, Tocqueville, Fuggelin, Sturzo, two conservatives, two liberals, two Catholics, two Protestants. But all four had a clearly Christian inflection. One of the first analyses of political religion from an avowedly secular perspective is found in Raymond Aron's writings on secular religions. Aron defined secular religions as, quote, doctrines that in the souls of contemporaries take the place of a vanished faith, and that locate humanity's salvation in this world, in the distant future, in the form of a social order that has yet to be created. His concern, like Russell's, was not that political religion distorted religious truth. Rather, it was that it created unrealistic expectations about what was morally and politically possible, expectations that could easily issue into tyranny and tragedy. As the emigre intellectuals of the interwar period returned to the scholarly pursuits they had been forced to abandon, they took the new theory of political religion with them. The result was a steady stream of increasingly specialized studies focusing on topics such as fascist ritual, Hitler's theology, and statistical correlations between Protestant beliefs and Nazi voting, to name just a few. But the overarching narrative remained the same. The rise of political religion was connected to the decline of traditional religion, and not only within the West. The rapid spread of Marxist movements throughout Asia could also be folded into this story. So could the rise of radical Islamist movements beginning in the 1980s. Recall that Tocqueville had already described Islam as a political religion over a century earlier. It was around the time that Tocqueville was first writing his book on the French Revolution that Charles Darwin first introduced his famous distinction between lumpers and splitters. Lumpers lump things together. That is, they look for similarities, while splitters split things apart. They look for differences. The literature on political religion has been dominated by lumpers. Jacobinism, communism, fascism, Nazism were all lumped together during the interwar years. And in the ensuing decades, Christianism, Islamism, secular progressivism, and radical multiculturalism were also added to the lump. When a few overzealous campus activists and evangelical pastors are tossed into the same bucket as the SS and the Khmer Rouge, I think it's time for some splitting. So let's start by splitting up religion. Now, my reading, perhaps oversimplified, sociologists of religion have defined their object of study in at least four different ways. I'm going to call these approaches phenomenological, ontological, ritual, and institutional. The phenomenological approach makes individual experience the basis of all religion. It includes approaches that are explicitly grounded in philosophical phenomenology from the early 20th century. So here one thinks, for example, of Peter Berger's writings on the social construction of reality and his famous book, The Sacred Canopy. But it also includes other approaches that are not explicitly phenomenological. For example, Rudolf Otto's neo-Kantian approach, or more recently, Hans Joas's neo-pragmatist approach. The common denominator here is the appeal to experiences of self-transcendence as the starting point for religion. The notion of transcendence is also central to what I'm calling ontological approaches, though it's understood rather differently, not in terms of experiences, but rather in terms of representations. Specifically, representations that divide the world into two distinct realms that are thought to be ontologically discontinuous with one another. Earthly versus heavenly, changing versus unchanging, created versus uncreated, and so on. The best examples here are Weberian and neo-Weberian approaches to religion. Weber famously distinguishes between magic and religion. In the magical worldview, divine powers live in the same world as human beings, like the Greek gods on Mount Olympus. In the religious worldview, they live in a separate realm, like the God of the Bible and the Quran. From this perspective, the idea of primitive religions is a contradiction in terms. Primitive societies do not know religion, they know only magic. Not so, of course, in the ritual approach. It makes collective enactment and bodily experience into the fons et orgo of all religion. The paradigmatic example of the ritual approach is, of course, Durkheim's theory of collective effervescence, a shared focus of attention, synchronized speech and movement, often song and dance, sometimes also intoxicants, all culminating in a state of collective ecstasy and the merging of self and other. Such are the familiar dynamics of collective effervescence. It is the contrast between such heightened states of collective emotion and the humdrum routines of everyday life, the Durkheimians argue, that are at the root of all distinctions between sacred and profane, and thus of all religion too. The fourth and final approach is institutional. It defines religion in terms of a set of religious elites and organizations that are clearly differentiated from non-religious elites and organizations. Priests and monks, theologians and gurus, tabernacles and monasteries, and so on. On this account, the emergence of religion is connected to the emergence of agrarian societies, societies that generate an economic surplus that can be used to support a division of labor, including a class of intellectual and ritual specialists. So, four different typologies, four different approaches to religion: phenomenological, ontological, ritual, and institutional. This is obviously an ideal type. All of the usual Weberian disclaimers apply. These are pure types rarely found. In reality, mixed and hybrid types are the rule. So what is the point of this little theoretical detour? What leverage does this give us over the problem of political religion? Well, there are a couple of different ways in which we can use this typology to get a better handle on this problem. The first is simply to use it as a yardstick, a scale, more formally, to measure how religious, as it were, a particular political movement is. Does it resemble a religion in one of these senses, two, three, all four, and to what degree? This also enables us to compare and contrast two or more political movements with one another in a quasi-quantitative fashion. So let's start with a comparison of National Socialism and political correctness. I realize this seems like, a crazy comparison to make, but it's actually not as unusual as you think. Just to give you a quick example here. So let's start where all such comparisons start, namely with the Nazis. Experiences of individual transcendence, check. Just look at the rapt faces in one of Leni Riefenstahl's famous propaganda movies. What inspired it? Maybe it was Hitler's charisma, but maybe it was also the ritual pageantry of Nazism. So check again. Ontological discontinuity? Well, to some degree. There's, of course, the Manichaean distinction between Aryans and Jews, along with the secularization of race and nation. There are also millenarian elements, Hitler's 1,000-year Reich and Christ's millennial rule. How about at the level of elites and institutions? Well, about the existence of a Nazi elite with a quasi-sacred status and putatively superhuman powers? No question about that. Elitism was central to the entire Nazi program. About Nazi institutions, more debate is possible. Here we might recall Hannah Arendt's famous definition of totalitarianism as a perpetual motion machine that dominated via disruption more than through order. Still, all in all, Nazism obviously scores very high on the political religion scale. Now, what about our politically correct campus activists? I think it's pretty obvious that American multicultural activism is not a political religion to anything like the degree that German National Socialism was, but let's just go through the exercise anyway. Experiences of individual transcendence. Well, maybe, there's this whole being woke thing, I suppose. But let's face it, Judith Butler is not Adolf Hitler. A powerful speaker, yes. A charismatic demagogue, not so much, right? And a campus rally isn't exactly the Nuremberg rally in terms of ritual and pageantry, more disorganized. Ontological discontinuity, there's a little bit of a tendency to demonize white guys and romanticize people of color, I guess, but this is hardly comparable to Nazi anti-Semitism and Aryanism. Is there a PC elite that's equivalent to the German SS? No. There are some people who think they're smarter and more enlightened than everyone else, maybe with fancy degrees from fancy colleges like Yale. But let's be serious. Shouting down speakers is not the same as shooting down subhumans. Comparison between Nazis and campus activists are overwrought and, frankly, more than a little bit irresponsible. What about right-wing populist movements? The case for considering them to be political religions seems on its face to be a little bit stronger. Most of these movements are built around a single charismatic leader who is idolized by his followers. It's usually a he, of course, though not always. They're also built on an idealized vision of the common people, which is typically juxtaposed to a corrupt elite or some sort of outsider group, immigrants and refugees, for example. They are hierarchically organized, usually in political parties or movements. There can be a courtly elite of kind whose status is based on its proximity to the charismatic leader. And populist parties often have somewhat more elaborate rituals than your typical political party. You think of a Trump rally, or don't, as you prefer, but lots of red MAGA hats, chants of lock her up, ritual denunciations of the mainstream media, right? So one way of using our typology of religion is to distinguish different degrees of political religion. As I noted earlier, there's also a second. We can use the four definitions to distinguish different types of religious politics. By religious politics, I mean a relatively coherent vision of how religion should and should not enter into politics. The best starting point for such a typology, I think, is the fourth definition of religion. That is the definition in terms of elites and institutions. So here I've just proposed that you imagine religion and politics the way that most sociologists of religion tend to do, namely as separate spheres. And let's further imagine the relationship between these spheres as having both a vertical and a horizontal dimension, sort of two-dimensional. On the vertical axis, religion can be subordinate to politics, politics can be subordinate to religion, or they can be in a relationship of parity with each other. On the horizontal axis, the two spheres can overlap completely, they can overlap partially, or they can be completely separate. Okay, and you do this, you'll wind up with a typology that looks something like this with 9 different cells in it. Now, the ones that are, I think, of interest for us this evening are the 4 in the upper left, in particular, the near neighbors of political religion, what I'm calling clerical authoritarianism and religious nationalism. And here's my sort of clumsy attempt at a graphic that maybe helps to sort of give you the visualization here a little bit more clearly. So, as I'm presenting here, political religion means the subordination of religion and also its complete or near complete absorption into politics. To be honest, I'm not sure that a political religion of this sort has ever really existed in the modern world, except perhaps as an aspiration. Had the Jacobins remained in power for several generations? Had they been able to complete their program of de-Christianizing France? Had they made their cult of reason into the religion of France? But it's not clear to me that regimes such as these could have survived for long enough to institute a political religion. I suspect that political religion may actually be a self-limiting and self-undermining phenomenon. Consider, Jacobinism succumbed to its own radicalism. It ate its children, as the saying goes, and one could tell a very similar story about Nazi aspirations to found a political religion. Perhaps it could only have survived by routinizing and institutionalizing and bureaucratizing themselves, in which case they would no longer have been political religions. One could perhaps argue that this is what happened in the Ba'athist regimes of Syria and Iraq, which were, as we know, partly inspired by European fascism. It's arguably also what happened in communist Russia and China as Leninism gave way to Stalinism and Maoism to reformism. But what about the fascist regimes of Mediterranean Europe, or Franco's Spain, Mussolini's Italy, or the Romanian Iron Guard? On my reading, they are actually closer to the type of clerical authoritarianism. There was never really any serious talk of abolishing the established churches in these countries, nor was there widespread resistance to fascism from within the churches either. On the contrary, there was active support for fascist rule in many quarters and passive acquiescence in most. Now, what about contemporary populist movements? Where do they fit into this typology? As yet, I do not see any serious aspirations to establish a political religion of a totalitarian sort. The self-proclaimed goal of these movements is typically to defend Western Christian civilization or Islamic civilization, if one thinks of Turkey's Erdogan, not to replace it with a non-theistic or non-Christian cult. Nor have these movements given way to the elaborate rituals that are typical of fascism or to the kind of systematic ideology that define communism. On the contrary, many scholars argue that it's precisely the lack of a coherent ideology that is the defining feature of populism. So it's not clear what a populist religion would look like. MAGA hats and a little chanting, Twitter tirades and reality TV. So just what is the relationship between populism and religion? I think this is a very important intellectual and political question at the moment. I would argue that it's better captured by these other two categories of religious nationalism and clerical authoritarianism. Now, what do I mean, first of all, by religious nationalism? As I define it here, is the view that religious and political identity and institutions should be as closely aligned as possible. In the United States, for example, Christian nationalists believe that you cannot really be a good American, or frankly even a real American, unless you are also a good Christian, and vice versa. Christian nationalist ideologues also argue that the founding fathers were Orthodox Christians, in some sense, and that the founding documents are based on Christian principles, or in some very extreme versions, were literally handed to the founders by Christ himself. I'm not making this up. I can show you some illustrations. Often, now, Christian national, where am I here? So, European populists are not usually Christian nationalists in quite this sense. They tend to be cultural Christians. Often they don't attend church or even pretend to do so. They simply claim that European culture has Christian roots and that therefore non-Christians cannot really assimilate into European culture. They're also secular Christians. They claim that European secularism has Christian roots in the separation of worldly and spiritual power. And they argue that Muslims are therefore doubly unassimilable. Muslims are not only culturally alien and unassimilable, they are also unsecularizable, because Islam knows no separation of religious and political authority. Now for the other category, clerical authoritarianism. What do I mean by this? As I'm defining it, it rests on a quid pro quo. It arises when important factions of the clergy ally with a secular strongman. The strongman promises to protect the churches from its most hated enemies, liberals, humanists, communists, whatever. He also admits some members of the clergy into his inner circle. In return, the clergy not only ignores the irreligious beliefs and behaviors of the strongman, but proclaims him a saint and a savior, even when his policies are clearly violating religious values. This was the dominant type of religious politics in Latin fascisms. One sees a less developed form of clerical authoritarianism in the populist regimes of Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and Hungary, and I would argue an incipient form of clerical authoritarianism in the United States. There, prominent evangelical and Pentecostal clerics, such as Jerry Falwell Jr. and Paula White, not only make excuses for Trump's manifestly unchristian behavior, they not only proclaim, contrary to all evidence, that he is a man of deep faith, they even imply that he is an agent of divine providence and that his election was a genuine miracle. Some commentators have insightfully characterized these leaders as Trump's court evangelicals. In the strange alliance between evangelicalism and Trumpism, we glimpse, I think, an incipient form of clerical authoritarianism. So, where does this leave us? Returning to the question of political religion in the contemporary world. Are we in fact entering a new era of political religions? Is populism a political religion? What about multiculturalism? What's the final verdict on the political commentators I introduced at the beginning of my talk? I have to say I'm myself am of two minds. First, the positives. Viewing populism and multiculturalism through the lens of religion is revealing. Right-wing populist movements do resemble political religion in some respects. They often apotheosize their leaders and attribute almost supernatural powers to them. Recall Trump's speech before the Republican National Convention, "I alone can fix it. I am your voice." Many of his evangelical and Protestant followers compare him to biblical figures, such as King David, that's the adultery part, or more often to Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor who liberated the ancient Israelites from their Babylonian captivity. Some of his more youthful and secular followers liken him to Napoleon or to video game superheroes. It's true. But neither populism nor Trumpism is an ism in the same sense or to the same degree as, say, communism or liberalism, both of which gave rise to systematic doctrines that justified specific policies. Nor do Trump's tweets and temper tantrums and reality TV antics match in any way the carefully choreographed rituals and spectacles of fascism and communism. Right-wing populism in Europe and the US contain elements of religious nationalism and clerical authoritarianism, but I see little evidence thus far of any aspiration to establish a true political religion. What about the radical identity politics of wokesterism? These movements do indeed recall certain elements of religious sects. They make strong claims to moral purity and truth. They draw sharp boundaries around themselves and expel those who do not conform. They like to speak truth to power, but are often reluctant to engage in dialogue. They have their great prophets and theologians, their Foucaults and Butlers, and they do seek to spread their gospel in the halls of power, into corporate HR departments and university admissions committees, for example. What is more, their most zealous followers are often post-Protestants or secular Jews who do make politics into a religion of sorts, that is, into the primary source of their own personal values and identity. So the political religion narrative does shed some light on these movements too. Still, the political religion label seems like a very serious misnomer to me, insofar as this suggests overdrawn and inflammatory comparisons with the totalitarian movements of the 20th century. Now for the negatives. The theory of political religion claims that secularization leads directly to the sacralization of politics, and that politics was and should be a purely profane affair. All of these claims are highly contestable. Hasn't politics always partaken of the sacred? Think of the tradition of sacred kingship. It first emerged at least 5 or 6 millennia ago. Conversely, it is not at all clear that a purely secular politics is even possible. Indeed, that is one of the deepest insights of the theory of political religion. It was precisely the political movements that were most aggressively secular that were also most deeply sacralizing. Consider Marxism. Was it the dry reasoning of Das Kapital that made it a world historical movement? Or was it the millenarian prophecies of the Communist Manifesto? The latter, of course. To the degree that a truly secular politics has ever been possible, it was only because traditional religion exercised an effective monopoly over the legitimate forms of the sacred. Today, of course, this monopoly is highly contested, but not only by political movements. Political religions may be one possible consequence of secularization, but they are hardly the only one. One could also speak of ascetic religions, for example. What I have here in mind are the stylistic subcultures that many people inhabit during their youth, with their Talmudic rules concerning dress and diet, sex and love, music and art, and so on. One could even speak in a sense of scientific religions. Here I'm thinking of the techno-utopians who populate places like Silicon Valley, with their dreams of transhuman apotheosis and millenarian singularities, their sci-fi canons and their fantastical scriptures. One could easily give still more examples of sexual religions or economic religions. And this fragmentation of the sacred places limits on the sacralization of politics too. Like the Temple Mount, many different faiths must share the space of the sacred today. Indeed, in retrospect, one could even argue that the political religions of the 20th century were not solely or even primarily a consequence of secularization as such. Rather, they were the consequence of a unique historical conjuncture between secularization on the one hand and statism, nationalism, and imperialism on the other. The reason that state, nation, and empire rushed in to fill the God-shaped hole left by secularization is because they were filling everything in this period. If so, then contemporary prophecies about the return of political religion are probably overblown. Humpty Dumpty can't be put back together again. What we are witnessing today is not the return of political religion so much as the fragmentation of the sacred. Note that this is not the same thing as secularization, as that term is usually understood. In the orthodox version of secularization theory, the withering of religion goes hand in hand with the growth of reason. That seems to me like a badly mistaken reading of modern history. Outside of certain milieux, Western and cosmopolitan milieu, religion is not waning at all. And even within those milieux, it is not giving way to reason so much as to new forms of the sacred. Some, including myself, have therefore proposed that the present age is not a secular age so much as a post-secular age, in the specific way that Shai and Yochi have proposed. This is not to say that we are returning to a pre-secular age in which organized religions claimed a monopoly over the legitimate forms of the sacred, and with a great deal of success. As Weber rightly recognized over a century ago, the present age has in many ways more in common with pre-Christian antiquity, with its multiple and competing gods, an age in which monotheism can only triumph in alliance with state power. The post-secular condition is not one in which scientific rationality replaces revealed religion, so much as an age in which monotheism gives way to polytheism, or, less theologically, in which cultural monism gives way to cultural pluralism and hybridity. I know of no better summary of the personal and political promises and perils of the post-secular condition than these wise and witty words spoken by the late novelist David Foster Wallace. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship, and the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it JC or Allah, be it Yahweh or the Wiccan Mother Goddess or the Four Noble Truths or some inviolable set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. On one level, we all know this stuff already. It's been codified as myth, proverbs, cliches, epigrams, parables, the skeleton of every great story. The whole trick is keeping the truth up front in daily consciousness. It's a trick we would all do well to practice today. Thank you very much. I'm actually fine standing.
Thank you very much for this wonderful, thought-provoking and inspiring talk. And we can take some questions, comments. Yes, please.
Your fundamental focus.
Well, you need the mic. One moment, please.
Your fundamental focus has been, to a great extent, on the West in general. At the risk of opening up a can of worms here, how would you characterize, in terms of your quadrangle, for example, the relationship between Shinto and the Chrysanthemum throne in Japan?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, the reason I didn't stray too far from North America and Western Europe isn't because I don't find these cases interesting, but of course just because I, fear to go too far beyond my my areas of expertise and say something that's just really stupid. But now, since we're now in the Q&A, I'll just go ahead and do my best. I guess I like my mentor Bob Bella, and then also like the late Shmuel Eisenstadt, tend to see Japan as a kind of a peculiar and exceptional case in some ways. I mean, at least in the, if you accept to some degree their argument about an axial revolution or an axial age, and you further accept the idea that one can see a kind of an East Asian variant of this in Confucianism and Taoism, then Japan, for them, constitutes a kind of exception. I mean, one of the few modern societies that has not undergone an axial revolution, therefore does not have the sharp, never really in any of its major religious systems instituted this sharp distinction between the transcendent and the mundane, or the supramundane and the mundane. So in some ways, I think the way that Shmuel or Bob would answer this question would be say that the Chrysanthemum throne, it's in some ways it's better compared with one of these sort of pre-axial sacred forms of kinship. With this idea of of a monarch who was the literal lineal descendant of some kind of world-creating god or power. That's a very common idea, which lives on because of the lack of an axial breakthrough. And so, in some ways, Shinto. I'm thinking now of the kind of official state Shinto, late 19th century, up through the end of World War II. It's a little bit difficult to categorize because most of the religious nationalisms that I would think about, I mean, you really have these two sort of fully formed religious and political organizational elite apparatuses, and religious nationalism is about attempt to sort of fusing or aligning the two. Whereas at least my rather superficial knowledge is that state Shinto was somewhat more of an artificial creation of the Japanese, of the Japanese imperial and then fascist state. So that would be my best attempt at an answer. It's kind of a peculiar. It's hard to map onto these categories.
I couldn't do it. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Saf.
Thank you very much. Two short questions which I think are related. The first is about the term religion. It appears that in a way what you just described is a wonderful way to show how the term religion fails beneath all the typologies and models. And so the question is how one uses religion, and I'm thinking about Assad's claim about the appearance of religion and how it is formed and what is the ideological use of it. And the complementary question is about liberalism, which seems to be the transparent agent in your talk. All the others of, you actually investigated all the others of the liberal state, all the people that good liberals are afraid of, from the right and the left, and civil religion was, I think, the most uninvestigated player. So, yeah.
Sure. So I think I agree with you about the difficulties of the term religion up to a certain extent. So I think that the whole discussion about the discourse of religion within religious studies, the many different histories of the way in which the term religion has been used, first within kind of a Western Christian theological context, and then the way it was applied or misapplied outside of that context of origin. I think that's all been quite revelatory, though. I mean, my own view is still that there is a there there. That, I mean, there is something about religion which is not just a discursive construct, and I think the sort of the best articulation of this argument that I know of is actually by the late Martin Riesebrot. So it's has a, I won't gloss the entire book, but gives some very interesting examples. I think to me, one of the most compelling one was the degree to which what I'll call religious elites from different traditions, different contexts, recognize one another as somehow of the same type. So, the way in which, Catholic missionaries to China recognize Confucian scholars as somehow like them, to the degree that they even take on some of their garb. I mean, this is a kind of a common phenomenon. So that I do think that there is something. There are limits to the historical construction argument. The civil religion. I mean, that's the subject of my most recent book, of course, and I didn't want to just sort of repeat myself, by putting in a plug for civil religion. But I mean, I do think that this, if I were making a plug in terms of this typology, I mean, the way that I'm thinking about it is that it presumes a certain parity between the religious and political spheres, and it doesn't imagine that the two can be fully separated. I mean, the idea that somehow religious people shouldn't have any non-liberal political convictions and that they should never use non-liberal political language in public debate. I reject that idea, and I equally reject the idea that there is a kind of completely secular politics which is completely bereft of any sort of these transcendent convictions. I think that's also a form of self-deception, and so civil religion, the way I'm conceiving it, is a kind of a middle ground where some kind of mutual recognition between people of faith and no faith is possible, where a religious person can see a sort of religious truth in a secular philosophy, where a secular philosopher can see a kind of a secular truth in a religious narrative. I mean, that's a very of course, in reality, I mean, civil religions aren't that. They're very specific practices and stories and symbols and people, who are memorialized and remembered within a particular polity is helping to define that polity. But I wouldn't see it, at least as I understand it, as liberal, not at least in the stronger sense of that term. So in some ways, I even see it as sort of anti-liberal or communitarian in the sense that civil religion presumes a kind of a non-voluntary character of political belonging. I mean, most of us don't choose the culture or the polity that we live in. We're simply born into it, for better or for worse. And, we have to make the best of that, even if we feel the contract, such as it is, has been violated. And whatever sort of individual rights and liberties we might enjoy within the context of that polity also depend on institutions and rules that may sometimes be at odds with our own personal identity or interest. So, in a word, my understanding of civil religion is more communitarian, I suppose. And in that sense, sort of critical not of liberalism in a sort of generic sense of left of center, but critical of liberalism in this stricter philosophical sense of individual autonomy and social contracts and mutual benefit and everything that contractarian tradition gives us.
Well, what I have is not an argument, but rather an impression. And the impression is that I feel a little bit uncomfortable after your speech. Because if it is true that such a thing like political religion is a historical result of a conjunction of secularism and nationalism, as you said, then one asks whether it is helpful to use that term today at all. I mean, and in your arguments there were a lot of things where you said that every religion is political, and you said that there is in secularity a religious element, and in religion is a secular element. So what do you mean by all these concepts now, which become so much confused or so near by one another, that I wonder whether they are really analytical concepts anymore? Is it useful to use these concepts in which way? Would you argue for a new definition of them, of secularity or of religion, or is it something? Well, do they represent a state of mind of a past situation? I'm a bit confused how you use the concepts, because in a way they are traditional, and then your argument is that something new happens and that we have to use them in another way. So, well, you see the problem.
Well, I mean, I think they are useful as tools for both making historical and political judgments. So historical judgments, you know, with contemporary populism, a political religion in the same sense that Nazism and fascism were? I don't think so. That's the historical judgment, and that also implies a certain kind of political judgment about how we should respond to those movements as well. So I mean, those are the two ways that I'm trying to use this typology, right? I mean, there's this narrative that's being mobilized, at least in contemporary American political discourse, about secularization giving rise to, in a kind of automatic way, to political religion. And I'm trying to sort of qualify that narrative in certain ways. And whether I think the second question is a trickier one. I think what you're asking is something like political religion even possible anymore now? I think that the implication of the talk is it's much less likely. I mean, nothing is impossible. You know, I mean, I learned that in 2016. Nothing is impossible, right? So, but it does seem to me less likely. In part because of, if I'm right in saying that the sacred has been increasingly fragmented. I think it is, for example, incredibly interesting, you may know this, that one of the key platforms or key arenas where support for Trump originally evolved was online gaming communities. In particular, there's probably not that, I mean, I'm way too old to have known about this if I hadn't read about it, but 4chan, which is this kind of very, I mean, I'm even looking at some of the people I know to be, no, okay. Anyway, these very sort of subversive, irreverent, online, with heavy overtones of kind of misogyny and eventually racism. This becomes one of the major platforms for Trumpism, and this is, I mentioned in my talk about how some of Trump's fans presented him as kind of like a game video game superhero. Those are the people I'm talking about. And you can easily find this if you do, a Google image search. But I don't know, at some point maybe they're going to get bored with Trump and they're just going to, and there's, I don't know, the next Mortal Kombat video game comes out and they decide they'd rather spend their time gaming. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I think that, there's just so many different things that people can become cathected to and distracted with today that, the kind of cult-like, it'd be very difficult to create this sort of cult-like devotion. It's even hard to imagine assembling that many people into some sort of gigantic mass ritual pageant of that sort. I mean, would that even excite a lot of these kids anymore? I don't know. I'm not so sure. So I think I guess what I'm saying is I think that there's it's sort of Madisonianism. So Madison famously says that the best remedy for tyranny is faction. The more divided people are up into little groups, the more difficult it becomes to assemble people into one massive group. So, I mean, on the one hand, you can sort of bemoan this fragmentation of the sacred, but I think it does, to some degree, immunize us against, really sort of radical political religion of this sort. But speculation, I don't know. I mean, it's a profound question, but a very difficult one.
Thank you very much. Okay, one last question. Two last question. Eva and Shlomo, but short one, please.
Yeah, I have a very short
Wait. 1 minute. No, I really need it for recording.
I have a very short question. You referred to secularity a few times in terms of a whole to be filled. I wasn't sure if you were just using the commonly received idea of how the secular is, namely a kind of empty space that is left by religion, or do you think, as I do, because I'm French and their secularity is a quasi-religion, do you think that secularity and secularism can have and do have, I mean, it's not only normative but descriptive, actually a full existence, a full, solid ontological basis and phenomenological basis?
Absolutely, yes, I do think that. I really was using the God-shaped whole. It's a common metaphor, and I think it's the one that lies behind some of the commentaries that I opened the talk with. So particularly in the French case, this is very clear to me. What you said, that secularity is something that has real substance. It's not just empty space.
It seemed to me that you were, maybe this is my fault, but it seemed to me that you're sort of moving back and forth in a slippery way between two connotations of religion, or two definitions of religion as phenomenology. In other words, and then when you say that Jacobins or communists, etc., are religious, it's in terms of the general phenomenology of these political movements, and that's well accepted. And then there's also religion as a historical, traditional, doctrinal institution. Now, it seems to me, and it could be that I'm wrong, but it's something my research is involved with. It seems to me that we're seeing, when I was interested particularly in your definition of religious nationalism, where you said it's collective identity, and it's seeing national identity in religious terms, by which you meant, or at least the Israeli case, and from what I understand, the European case today, the populist nationalist European case, is seeing national identity in terms of traditional, institutionalized, historical, doctrinal religion, whether Christianity in one form or another, whether Orthodox Judaism in one form or another, light, not light, etc., here in Israel. Now, do you think that that's a new phenomenon, that we're defining nationalism in these received religious terms, or do you think it's always been with us, or do you think that something's going on? I'm just curious about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I have this, I think, somewhat unorthodox view amongst students of nationalism that this is something which has been with us for a very, very long time. So just speaking, to the American case, my own view is that religious nationalism, in more or less its current form, is already there in the second generation of Puritanism. So it was already there in the 1670s and 1680s. It arises in the context of the sort of bloody struggles between the native peoples and the Puritans. And so what I see as both its sort of two core elements are a certain apocalyptic interpretation of biblical prophecy and a sort of understanding of kind of Manichaean struggle between good and evil. That's already there in the second generation of Puritanism. I am also of the somewhat unorthodox view that that Western European, that the germ cell for Western European nationalism in general is found in a particular Christian reception of the Hebrew Bible and an appropriation of the notion of chosenness in the triptych of land, autonomy, people. So I'm not one of these people who thinks that nationalism started with the French Revolution or around that time, nor am I one of these people who thinks that nationalism somehow replaces religion. I mean, it can be that. There are secular forms of religion, but those to me are not the root form and not even the most relevant form in the US and probably not in Israel either.
Thank you very much for...
Thank you.